You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
Let us have a sermon. We are in the middle of a series on the purpose of life. And we've said that whatever you think your purpose in life is going to color the way you live the next decade, and it's going to color the way you live the next 5 minutes. If every decision you make is in light of what you think the purpose in life is. And so if your purpose is to maximize pleasure and comfort, if your purpose is to leave a legacy, if your purpose is to give and receive love, whatever that is, that's going to change how your day looks, how your relationships function, how your attitude and your emotions play out. And so if you want to know, what you think your purpose in life is, take a look at your schedule, at your relationships, your to-do lists, your attitudes, and you'll get a pretty good idea of what you think your purpose for being is. And what we've seen is that Christianity, and Jesus comes into this picture and says that you need a purpose larger than one you make up yourself if you want it to have any real traction. You want to spend your life being successful. Your purpose in life, you think, is leaving that legacy or trying to be a nicer person. But what we've noticed is that if you're the one making that decision, then really it doesn't matter which one you pick. In other words, if you have a bunch of options in front of you and you choose one to be your purpose in life, it's not really a purpose. It's just your choice dressed up in nicer clothes. And Christianity says that you're actually created to find a true purpose, like a purpose with a capital P, outside of yourself. You need a designer if you want to know what you're designed for. And Jesus offers that to you. What Jesus comes in and says to all humans is, I'm going to give you a chance to live a life that's more than just a dressed up version of your personal desires, of your personal preferences. And he tells us that the purpose of our life that we all have is to make disciples. You want to live a life bigger than what you come up with on your own? Then you have to make disciples. You got to take up your calling to make disciples. And that breaks out, we've said, into three things. Into being disciples. Before you can make a disciple, you got to be one. And then walking with disciples. A huge factor in making disciples is walking with other disciples in close community. And then inviting new disciples to walk with you, to be disciples that walk with you. Before Easter, we looked at being disciples. And then now we're looking at walking with disciples, because being a disciple draws you in to close relationships with the other disciples who are following Jesus next to you. And when people become Christians, no matter their background, their age, their life stage, their ethnicity, whatever you have, you find a deep community just springing to life. And so last week, we went over really the theory of community, the theory of how that all works itself out. And we said that really this community is a deep, interdependent set of relationships with people for the purpose of growth. That's the making of disciples with one another. And for the next 3 weeks, we're going to go, okay, how do you put that theory into practice? And next week, we look at the actions. The week after that, we look at words. But this week, we have to look at lifestyle. We need to look at how do you arrange your lifestyle to produce this kind of community, to make room. And we're going to look at a passage in the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 41 through 47. It's on page 911 of your pew Bibles. That's the red book in front of you. It's also on the screen. This is the early church story. This is the first church. This is the first time the church showed up. It starts in verse 41 of chapter 2. Peter had just preached a sermon, and here's the response, starting in verse 41. So those who received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. This is the word of the Lord. Now, what you see here, 3,000 people become Christians, the first 3,000 really to become Christians, and there's this explosion of community. 3,000 people in a city that's as diverse as ours, at a time when all this diversity was right there in the middle of a festival. And what happens? They begin to live these whole new communal lives. In other words, they're walking together. They become followers of Jesus, and they're living out that command to teach one another to obey all that he commanded you. They're living out their purpose in life. They're making disciples of one another in this deep, interdependent community. And it's fascinating because they weren't just doing what other people were already doing. You know, you come into a church today, let's say you're new, you're here today, it's not that hard to look around and go, okay, what do these people do? And sort of go, okay, so I can start doing that. There was no church. This was the first one. So it's not as though they were just sort of aping what everyone else was doing. No. The most natural thing that happens when people become Christians is that they get deeply involved with one another. You never see in the book of Acts pastors running around saying, guys, I really wish you'd show up more often. I really wish you'd come to the meetings. We'll have a raffle. I promise you only have to hang out with people you like. Like, you never see them saying that because it was a very natural thing for them to do this. It was a sign of life. You know, it's like a plant growing towards the sun. The minute that there's life in a plant, you will find it growing towards the sun. And the minute the Holy Spirit's in your soul, you'll find yourself growing towards others in deep community. And what that's going to require, see, before we can talk about how to do it, how to actually act on it, really, it's going to require you to rearrange your life. Because these folks, they had to adjust their life in massive ways to make room for the growth they're experiencing, to make room for the community. I mean, 3,000 disciples, they had to experience a total lifestyle shift in order to have the community they had. And so the question for us today is now, what kind of shift do we have to make? What kind of adjustments do we have to make to experience this kind of community? To really live out your purpose of walking with disciples, what has to change? And you can pull two things from this passage that need to change, that we need to adjust. First, we need to adjust our thinking, and then we need to adjust our lifestyle. Got to adjust your thinking, got to adjust your lifestyle. And what we're going to find, you can't make disciples unless you adjust your thinking and adjust your lifestyle for this kind of community. So first, you got to adjust your thinking. Now, when you look at the passage, I mean, just reading it on first glance, you realize there's more than some changed activities that these people are experiencing. There's a depth here. You can't do a few new things and experience the level of depth that they seem to have with each other. So what you have to do is get a new perspective on community, a new way of looking at community. And this passage teaches us to adjust our thinking in really a couple of ways. The first is this. You have to realize that community is central. If you ever want to experience this, you got to realize, adjust your perspective to see that the community it's a central thing for you. You know, if you look at what they're experiencing, to be a part of this community is not adjacent to their life. I mean, to be a part of this community is to be surrounded by friends, surrounded by community. There are people there that had needs and they had friends to help. They're learning together. They're spending a ton of time together. And you get the sense that you really couldn't be a Christian, not with these 3,000 here, and not understand those friendships to be a necessary part of your life. They weren't just sort of peripheral, they were central. You know, and that's the Bible's testimony across the board. You know, back in the garden, when Adam's created, and you read the story, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and you see this litany of things. It's a refrain over and over again, like a song. It's like the chorus, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good. Everything's good. And there's this jarring moment where all of a sudden, before sin enters the world, he says something's not good. And it's when he looks at Adam and he says, it's not good that man should be alone. So before sin enters the world, it's not a good thing to be alone. Perfection means togetherness. Being in paradise means having community. You were built to need friendships, to need that kind of community. Woven into your makeup, into your soul, is a need for deep community. And that's important, especially here. You know, it's true everywhere, but it's important here because we live in a city, and living in LA can wear on you this way. Because if you live here, I've been here for 15 years now, 16 years. I can't count how many friends have moved away. It happens all the time. People are constantly moving away, and it can make it hard to not be jaded when new people show up. You know, or if you've moved here, you know, you come here for something. You come here for school. You come here for a job. You come here for X, Y, Z. And there's this sense of, well, I'm only here for a few years. I'm only here for this one thing, so I'm not really going to put down any roots. I don't really need friends while I'm here. I'm just going to leave. Or you get older, and you just realize how much time is required to maintain real friendship, and it just seems like a lot. Or you've had some real betrayal in your past. You know, and in a city like this, that happens a lot, where you think people are befriending you, and they're actually sort of just kind of using you. They're networking you, and you find out in rough ways. And you just don't really want to open yourself up again. Or the city has taught you, if you want to get ahead, you just can't have those kind of deep relationships. Look, you got to choose. You got to figure out what you want. Do you want to get ahead in your career? And so you need to put your relationships on the back burner for like 10 years. And in 10 years, you can reassess because you're a little more established, a little more firm in what's going on. But it's not good to be alone. In other words, you can't stop needing people because you think it'll turn out better in the long run. You can't stop needing people because you think you're not going to get hurt as much. When you try and convince yourself to not need people, and you never really do it consciously, but when you're teaching yourself not to need people, you're going against the grain of your own soul. You're rubbing against the grain of how you're made. And this passage shows you, if that's how you're made, if you're made to need friends, to need community, then that community has to be central to the entirety of your life. You look at verse 44, all who believed were together and had all things in common. That phrase, were together, that's more than just they met up consistently. There's a sense that they were identified with each other. They were together in their lives. And that means that you cannot think of your deep relationships as one part of your life. Adam didn't need a community because he was 9/10 of the way there. He had a great relationship with God, had his health, he had food to eat. He just needed some friends to get him over the edge to 100%. No, the idea is that community was the center out of which Adam was to enjoy everything else. You couldn't enjoy the food, you couldn't enjoy the health, you couldn't enjoy the life, you couldn't enjoy paradise without someone there to do it with you. Tim Chester's out in London, not in London, he's in England, and he puts it this way, he says, what tends to happen in the West is we compartmentalize. We put different facets of our life in boxes, and we begin to sort of juggle them ourselves. And so you have your work life, and you have your home life, and you have your social life, and you have your church life, and you have your hobbies, and so on and so forth. And you begin to sort of juggle them. And what happens is when there's a crisis in one of them, you drop all the others to focus on that one. So when you have a problem with family, you take time off of work, and you don't do your hobby for a while. You put other relationships on hold while you handle that problem. And he says, but can you imagine that happening in the early church? I mean, look at what we just read. Can you imagine that happening in Acts 2? He says, no. The community is how you handled the crisis. They're the ones bringing you food and meals. They're the ones helping you figure out what you're going to do. They're the ones encouraging you. They're the ones helping you process. I mean, the community is how you handled things. In Acts 2, see, there's no such thing as your problem. There's just our problem. That's the level of, that's what it means to make community central. That's how community is designed. It's meant to be central, not peripheral. It's not one part of your life. It's the way you live your whole life. And the same goes for decisions. A work decision is a work decision. Where you and your family lives, it's a family decision. But, can you imagine that happening in Acts 2? No, the community is how you made the decision. They're the ones helping you figure it out. They're the ones helping you weigh the options. They're the ones praying with you, encouraging you, helping you be wise. It's not good to be alone. And you can be surrounded by a sea of people. You can have a ton of friends, but you can still be living alone. You can still be deciding, handling your life totally alone. And it's not good to be alone. Now, how do you think about community, in other words? Is it central for you or is it peripheral? How do you handle your life? Do you handle life really on your own, or are people involved? How do you make decisions? How do you choose who to date, who to marry, where to live, where to work, how to handle your work, how to raise kids? Who makes your decisions with you? Is it alone? You don't need to get a community together every time you want to buy a cup of coffee. But how do you think about these things? How do you think about community? Do you think about it as central, or is it really something that's it's an add-on, it's peripheral? You got to think about it as central if you want to experience this. That's first. You got to realize it's central. Then you got to realize that it's messy. Look at verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship. They devoted themselves to the fellowship. Now that word devote is very telling because it means this didn't magically happen. They devoted themselves to it. And if you read the rest of the book, of the chapter in Acts, you realize that this is incredibly necessary because this is an extremely diverse group of people. The people Peter is preaching to in verse 5 are people from every nation under heaven. And it goes on, Egyptians, Persians, Arabs, Jews, Romans, and that's just 5 out of like 10, 11, 12 different places, cities people were from because of this festival that's going on. These are people who in that world would never be together, and yet they get saved, and all of a sudden, they're in each other's homes. Now, what kept them together? Well, in one sense, it's that they knew that they now had the most important thing in common. Following Jesus becomes the thing that trumps everything else in life, and therefore now you have more in common because you follow Jesus than anything you didn't have in common before. But that's not all that kept them together, because, see, they had to devote themselves to the fellowship. We looked at Ephesians 4 last week. We didn't have time to talk about this verse, but in verse 3 it says, Paul says, you need to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. You got to maintain the unity. He doesn't say you need to create the unity. No, there's a unity under there. You follow Jesus, there's a unity, but you have to maintain it. In other words, you need to be devoted to the fellowship. Why? Why do they have to do it in Acts 2? Why does Paul tell us to do it in Ephesians 4? Because your old way of thinking is going to keep creeping in. You're going to begin to think like you used to, and all you're going to be able to see is what divides you, not what you have in common. You need to devote yourself to see the unity, to find the unity. Let me put it this way. It's not forced, but it's purposeful. If you want to have real community, it's not a forced thing. You need to force yourself to do it. At the same time, you need to be purposeful about it. You ever seen a professional golfer swing a golf club? It looks like the most natural thing in the world. I mean, it looks like they were born with a club in their hands. You ever seen a professional guitarist play guitar? I mean, their fingers move on the fretboard like they were born to do it. But you ever tried to swing a golf club or try to play a guitar solo? It feels like the most unnatural thing you've ever done in your life if you haven't. Why? You think, how in the world can they do that? How can it be so natural for them and not natural for me? Well, the truth is, it takes work to bring out the natural in something. To bring out the natural in something, oftentimes you got to be devoted to it. You have to be purposeful about it. And you have a natural affinity with every other Christian in the world. You have the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. It exists. But it can take work to bring out that natural unity. You have to maintain it. You have to be devoted to it. And so, see, here's what ends up happening. This is why you got to change the way you think. You end up thinking either that the whole thing is work or that the whole thing is ideal. The whole thing is supposed to be easy. And either way you go, you miss it. There are some people who think that the whole thing's work. And I know some of you because you're here. And you look at diverse people in the church. I'm not talking about like necessarily big diversity, even just personality diversity. But you look at diversity in the church and you say, okay, I'm game for community. I am committed. I'm on board with the vision here, and I'm going to devote myself to fellowship with people that I don't necessarily click with. And just thinking about it makes you tired. Because you're thinking of all these relationships as nothing but work. You think you have to create the unity of the Spirit. You think there's nothing actually there. And so the whole thing is just constant work and maintenance, and you tire out so fast because you're not looking for anything. If you show up to your community group just expecting to work, but you aren't looking for the unity, if you never look for the thing that unites you, you're never going to find it. And so you go in spurts and you give up a lot, and you're just tired all the time, and then you just say, I got to take a break from this community thing. It's too much. But now that some of you are like that, but far more people in my experience are in the other camp. You have an ideal of what community is supposed to look like. And when that ideal meets reality, you get lost and frustrated and you're not sure what to do. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a book called Life Together on community, and he said, he who loves his dream of a community more than the community itself will destroy the latter. So if you love your ideals of what community should be more than the actual community around you, you're going to destroy the actual community around you. Because what he means is this, you show up somewhere and you get disappointed in the reality of what happens. You have these lofty ideas, it's going to be great, and everyone's going to love each other, and then sin exists. And so all of a sudden you get very disappointed, and you become radioactive. You get subtly toxic to the people around you because they're the ones getting in the way of the community that you really love. You know what the problem is? They're not doing it right. And it's so important for us to remember that Jesus commands us to love one another, not to love your awesome idea of how sweet it will be when we really love one another. You have to actually love the people, not the ideal about the people. And this is all. Let me give you a couple examples of this. I've found that if you've recently graduated college, this is extraordinarily difficult for you. And I have conversations all the time with recent graduates, very young people, young professionals who come out here, and they'll say, I don't know, this church doesn't really have the community I'm looking for. It's very difficult. And I always have to say, well, why do you think that is? And eventually in the conversation, you circle around to, well, you have to realize the last 4 years, you've been living in a small city full of Christians who are almost the exact same age you are, in almost the exact same life stage you are, who all got admitted to the same college you got into, and all of whom have multiple hours a day to just hang out with you. Like you can walk into each other's dorm rooms without having to call. And then you go to church and you find people who are 10 years older than you, maybe who didn't go to college at all, who have a bunch of kids that require like around-the-clock care, and you say, I wish we had better community. Yeah. The problem is not that the community is false. The problem is your ideals need to shift. You're loving an ideal more than the people God's put around you. And it's not just recent graduates. Let me tell you, the phrase, I just don't click with, is starting to grate on me. I just don't click with the people here. I feel like this church is more for blank. Talk to any pastor in Los Angeles. I guarantee you they've had this experience. They just get out the phone with someone who says, I just feel like this church is all about families and I'm single. And they get right on the phone with someone who says, I feel like this church is all about singles. It's not about families at all. Well, what's happening? There's an expectation there. I don't click with these people. I need to be somewhere where I click. And so we end up navigating our relationships in the church based on, do I click with that person? And the truth is, the more you get to know someone, the more you realize you don't click the way you thought you did. And so you almost always end up disappointed and feeling like there must be another place where you click with more people. No, the problem is we don't think about community right. We don't realize this is supposed to be messy. That unity doesn't maintain itself. And to be frank, you don't really have to devote yourself to the fellowship much if you all live on the same dorm floor and think the same things and say the same things. You don't really have to devote yourself to the fellowship much if you click with everybody perfectly. And the problem is we think we shouldn't have to devote ourselves to the fellowship. We think it should just naturally spring up. But if you think that way, if you don't realize it's messy, you're never going to experience the beauty of it. And you're never going to really have the beauty of it because, Owen Strachan, he's a theologian, he says, we should build local churches that feature members that have absolutely nothing in common with one another except Jesus. The world is split up into a million special interest groups, bitterly divided, endlessly polarized. The church of the Lord Jesus Christ should be gloriously different. Look out right now at America and ask what you think it needs to see. And I'll tell you, it does not need to see a church full of people who click with each other. It does not need to see a church full of people who all share the same life stage. Not to see a church full of people where it's very, very easy. It needs to see people who have that one glorious thing in common and say, and I'm devoted to find it. I'm devoted to experience it. I'm devoted to have it. When you don't realize that community is messy, when you don't realize that it's central, you end up alone because you will eventually find something hard about everything. But if you realize it's messy, if you devote yourself to the fellowship, you can uncover this deep unity that gets you past all the divisions. And only then are you really in a position to make disciples. Only then are you really in a position to be discipled by someone else. Only when it's central. Only when you realize it's messy, but you realize there's something underneath the mess that's glorious and that pulls you together, that Jesus himself. You got to adjust your perspective. But then you got to adjust your lifestyle. See, we tend to fall into camps here too. You either just think you should if I think about things differently, it'll magically happen, or if I just do things differently, it'll magically happen. Or you have to have both. You have to adjust your perspective and your lifestyle. And there's a few ways from this passage you can see that we need to adjust our lifestyle to make this work, to make room for this. The first is probably the most important, and that's you got to be intentional. This is sort of the one ring that rules them all. If you do this one, the other two will kind of flow out. But if you look at the passage, these people are rearranging their homes, their possessions, their schedules, their social lives, probably their hobbies. It's not as though they didn't have full lives before this. Becoming a Christian didn't sort of magically give them an extra 5 hours to sort of go, oh, cool, now I have 5 extra hours for the community thing that God added to my life. No, they had to reorganize their lives to experience this kind of community. It didn't just happen. They made room for it. There's a rule out there in the business world called Parkinson's Law. Essentially, it says things expand, work expands, but all things expand to fit the space allowed. Whatever you have, things will expand to fill it. It's like gas fills a room. It will always expand. It's true at work. If you get more time for a project, guess how long that project will take? That amount of time. It's true in your home. You move to a bigger apartment, and you say, what am I going to do with all this space? Look at all this storage. Within 6 months, it's full. And you go, how did I get all this stuff? If you're passive, your life will fill up without consulting you. It's just going to happen. And so making any kind of change, making any kind of space is going to require intentionality. If you want to have this kind of community, you have to be intentional about it. Put it another way. The most important things in life tend to feel the least urgent. Like everyone thinks it's important to be healthy. But you know what's a real thing? The double big gulp. I mean, it's 64 ounces. Just for reference, the human stomach is 30 ounces big. So it's over twice the size of your stomach. I mean, why do people call potatoes vegetables to feel better? Why is frozen pizza such a big seller? It's always on sale. But you don't do it because it doesn't feel urgent. You feel like it's okay to eat Red Baron pizza for lunch every day. It doesn't feel urgent. But when the doctor says, you can change your diet and give this a shot, or I can schedule your quadruple bypass today, guess what begins to feel urgent? Guess what begins to change? You change the diet. You get intentional. You make time. Isn't that a funny phrase? Make time? As though we can create it. We can't create it. We're meaning is we're getting intentional with things. And the same principle is true across the board. Tim Keller's out in New York. He says, in New York, the big problem is that people think of deep Christian relationships the way they think of air. He says, no one wakes up in the morning, you didn't wake up this morning and say, oh, I love air. It's just so, what good would my brain be? What good would my food be? What good would my life be without any air? He says, no, the only time you think about how much you love air is when you're underwater. And then you think, oh, I love air. I wish I had air. What good's my life without air? He says, the same thing's true of deep relationships. You don't realize you need them until you go under. They never feel urgent until you need them, and then it's too late. And he says, if you want important things to get done, you have to get intentional about them now. You can't be passive. You have to make time. You got to be intentional now. Now, what does that mean? Well, being intentional means you're going to have to create space. You have to make time, create space. Because your schedule right now, like you have a schedule right now for this coming week, it's going to fill up with demands. There are things that demand your time, bosses, kids, relationships, goals, whatever, that demands your time. This will never demand your time. And so you need to arrange your life so that you have some kind of capacity for this. Now, look, that looks different in different seasons. I have 4 children, 5 and under, running around my house. My capacity to have you over until midnight is pretty much shot right now. So creating space doesn't mean having a quota, but are you making this a priority? Are you being intentional with making space in your schedule, space in your life for these kind of deep relationships? And that should affect things like the way you choose your job, the way you choose where you live. And this can be a difficult concept, but is having that kind of deep Christian community, is that a factor in your decision about what job you take? Not the only factor, but is it a factor at all? Is having these kind of deep Christian relationships a factor in where you choose to live? Not the only factor, but is it a factor at all? It should affect the way you think about your hobbies, your extracurriculars. You got to be intentional and create space. But then it's not just about creating space. You also have to pursue. You got to pursue these relationships because relationally, I got to keep this short. But relationally, we suffer really from kind of an inertia. We don't move any more than we absolutely have to relationally most of the time. And other things are constantly getting in the way of us having these relationships. You can create the space, and yet it'll get filled up with other things unless you pursue these relationships. You have to create space so you have the time. Then you have to pursue people so you can enjoy the time together. Scott was telling me the other day, he says, I thought being a pastor would mean I wouldn't have to keep calling people. They'd call me. And it's not true. I've been doing this 10 years. Sometimes the people you're closest to are the ones you have to pick up the phone and call. It's not because they don't like you. It's just because we all suffer from the inertia. We all need to call each other. We all need to get purposeful. We need to pursue each other if you want to see this happen. You got to get intentional. If you want to have this community, you got to get intentional. That's first. But then there's some other ways to change your lifestyle. Second, you need to be generous. You look at verse 44 and 45. All who believed were together. They had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. The word fellowship actually means at its root to share. And you see that here in more ways than you'd expect. In the passage, you see it. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. They're helping each other learn. There's a sense in which I'm giving of my time to learn together with you. They're devoting themselves to prayer. They're praying for each other regularly. I'm devoting my time. I'm generous with my time to pray for you. They're selling their possessions for people who are in need. They're breaking bread together in their homes. It says with glad and generous hearts in the next verse. See, what they're doing, they're not just writing checks. They're not just doing a service project. They have generous hearts towards one another. And you need to cultivate a lifestyle of generosity if you want to have this kind of community. See, what these people are doing is they become Christians. They're knit together in this way, and they're intentional about it, and they look around and say to themselves, what do I have that can help somebody else? Do I have a home where we can meet? Do I have a prayer I can pray for them? Do I have something I can share with them? Do I have something I can sell to give them what they need? There's this outward orientation, this generosity, this assessment of what they have with an eye to giving it away. They have this constant question, what do I have that can help somebody else around me? And if you see it rightly, that's going to cover a whole lot more than money. This is a whole life generosity, a whole life kind of sharing. I mean, at some level, they basically looked at each other and said, okay, people who are in my home, my life is your life. My stuff is your stuff. What do you need? What do I need? What do we need? And let's do this for each other. Let's take care of each other. Let's be generous. Now, you got to ask what got them there. There's a way of looking at ancient people as though they were just nicer. Like they just sort of, that just came very naturally for them. They were always sharing stuff. It's a cultural thing. They sort of shared everything. And culture has its effects, but think about it this way. If you think, well, today that could never happen. Well, they had less stuff than we have. And they worked longer hours for less pay. Like they had less time, they had less stuff, so what they gave cost them more than it would cost us today. And they still gave it. What is it that got them to do this? Well, you see at the end of beginning of verse 47, it says, they're receiving their food with glad and generous hearts in verse 46, praising God and having favor with all the people. At some level, what you have to see is that all of this comes from them praising God. How do you get to a lifestyle like this? How do you become generous in your lifestyle? They praised God. What they believed, the thing that knit them together, the unity they had, was that they believed that Jesus had accomplished salvation for them, that there was nothing they'd done on their own, that he had died on a cross for their sins, rose from the grave to ratify the sort of the transaction went through, that they have an inheritance in heaven that can never be taken away, they can never lose, because they did nothing to earn it, so they can do nothing to lose it. They're basically taken care of for all of eternity. That's what knit them together. And so they understood that whatever they had, from time to money to themselves, to their talents, to their giftings, weren't what they needed to find satisfaction. They understood that these things were essentially all borrowed, that they were secondary to their ultimate possession, which was the Jesus that brought them together. Now, when you have that kind of posture as a Christian, when you see, in other words, what Jesus gave up for you and what he gave you, then all of a sudden you're going to have a whole life generosity. See, the reason you're being intentional, the reason you're creating space and pursuing people is because now you live for others the way Christ lived for you. Why? Because without this generosity, if you're not generous like this, you gotta understand this. Jesus inspires this in you, but you have to grasp it. If you're not this generous, you're never going to experience a real depth of community. It takes this kind of whole life generosity. Do you know why? Because if you aren't generous with your whole life, in other words, if you love the way that most human community loves, which is like this, I'll give plenty to you, I'll give a lot to you, I can even give myself to you in some ways, but there's a line that gets drawn. And if you ask me to go past that line, I leave you behind. I'm not going to love you that much. If you live in that kind of community, you'll never actually feel safe. You'll never actually feel like this is a place where you are wholly loved, because everyone around you has a line that you can't cross. But if you see Jesus crossing all the lines to save you, and you become a part of a community where you are giving that kind of radical generosity and a whole life kind of a love, all of a sudden you create a community that feels incredibly safe, incredibly compelling, incredibly winsome for people, and incredibly joyful for you, because the people around you, like you, are sinful and stumbling, but are dedicated to a whole generosity lifestyle, a whole lifestyle of generosity. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about that next week. That's basically the whole message next week. But for today, what does that look like? Your time, when you think about your time, when you have spare time, what do you do with it? I'm not saying you don't always have to go find I got some spare time, let me go find someone to hang out with. But I am saying, does it ever cross your mind to be generous with your time? Have you ever had some free time and thought, young moms, just don't sweat this. Have you ever had some free time and thought, you're the ones that need the time. Have you ever had some free time and thought, who could use my time right now? And even if you're a young mom, wherever you're at, even if it's a few minutes, it's not about what you can do. It's about the thought process. What's your lifestyle like? Is your lifestyle oriented outward? Have you ever had the thought, who could use my time right now? Your things. Have you ever sacrificed something for the sake of somebody else? Has your bank account ever taken a hit because someone else had a need. I'm not talking about indiscriminate giving. I'm not talking about, just kind of, I'm just saying the deep relationships, focus on your community group, the deep Christian relationships you have. Has anything ever taken a hit? Any of your possessions? Have they ever taken your car? Have they ever borrowed things from you? Have you ever taken a hit to give them something when they were in need? Have you ever looked at your things and said, who could really use this right now? And then even yourself, everybody has gifts, everybody has talents. Have you ever looked at what you do well and asked, who could use what I do well right now? Who could use this right now? There's a way of giving time and money, but not yourself. There's a way of really saying, okay, someone's in the middle of a crisis, a family crisis. Someone close to them has died. You know what? I'm going to give them tons of my time, and I'm going to work on helping them with ceremony and all the logistics. I'm going to cook them meals, and I'm going to give them. I'm going to help pay for the stuff, and they can do the ceremony in my backyard. And yet, at the same time, you never actually got close. You never gave them yourself. You never got close enough to feel it yourself. You never cried with them. Have you ever looked around and asked yourself, who could really use me right now? Who needs me right now? Like all of me. Do you see the whole life generosity, time, things, even yourself, all because that's what Jesus did for us. You got to change it. You have to have a lifestyle of that. If you ever want to experience that depth of community, that joy of feeling safe, of knowing that the people around you have your back all the way and you have theirs all the way, no lines. You have a generous lifestyle. But then finally, what you see here is you've got to be inviting. It's interesting because you look at, and the focus really is on, okay, so whoever had need, they sold stuff and gave to that person in need. What you have to realize, though, is that means, how did they know who had need? People had to reveal their needs. They had to be close enough in life to see when someone had a need. In other words, they're open about their needs, they're open about their homes, they're inviting people into their lives in every respect. This whole community breaks down if some people don't invite others in. If you're closed off, if all you do is give, but you're never open to receive. In other words, you can give your time, you can give your things, and still not be living in community, because all you're doing, it's basically a big good works project for you. It's a good social project. In Hebrews 3:13, it says, the early church is supposed to exhort one another every day, as long as it's called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. The point's pretty clear. He's saying, look, sin is deceitful. It can harden you. And if you want someone to be able to help, you have to exhort people to not be hardened by that deceitfulness. And if you ever want to not be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin, that means you need to invite people into your real life and your real heart and your real feelings and your real home life and your real work life, and give them license to tell you what you don't want to hear, where you're deceived. You got to let them in. You got to invite them in. You can open your wallet, but not your life. You can open your home, but not your life. You can open your mouth, but not your life. And the whole time, you can be incredibly deceived, all the while you're helping tons of people. And if the whole community becomes that way, then the depth is gone, you see. So what do? You can't just expect people to do this. Look, you cannot just expect people to speak into your life. Because culturally, we're conditioned to not ask about things that are personal. We are conditioned. What's the rule at every dinner party? Don't talk about religion and politics. How cool are you with going up to somebody that you just met and saying, hey, let me tell you how to parent your kids? Do you see, we're conditioned not to talk about these things because they're personal. It's none of our business. In other words, you can't expect someone to just feel free to do that. They're not going to feel free. You have to invite them to do it. You have to give them a license to do it, a hunting license for your sin. And this looks like, what does it look like? It looks like having conversations where you bring things up that you're actually thinking about. Are you losing sleep over anything? Are you worried? Are you anxious about stuff? Are there recurring thoughts you have a lot? Have you invited anyone into that? Have you opened that up with a deep Christian friend and said, you have a license not just to listen to me, but to help me figure it out. You have a license to say things I don't want to hear about this topic. I'm inviting you in. It looks like confessing sin honestly. This is a trouble spot for a lot of Christians, myself included, because there's this way that you want to confess sins that now you have under control. Oh, that thing I used to struggle with, and now it's wrapped up in a nice little bow. See how pretty it is now? Oh, but it was really tough back then. We want that story, but that's not our story. We have ongoing things that we deal with. What's the sin you keep hidden? What's the topic that when it comes up, you find yourself making it always look a little better than it is around people and trying to change the subject? Have you ever invited anyone into that? Have you ever opened up and said, here's what my life's really like. Here's what things really are like. And you have a license to get in this with me even when it's messy, even when it's not put together. You have a license. I'm inviting you in. Or honestly, bringing people into your home. It looks like bringing people into your home, but not to entertain them. Bringing them in so they can know you. Of course, okay, look, you want to love people well. You want to love them because, you want to love them by having a relatively clean house and they come over. You want to love them by cooking a good meal. That's all well and good. But is there anyone in your life that you have that can come over to a house that was tidied up in the last 5 minutes where you threw laundry off the one chair they could sit in and you eat hot dogs? And they see, and when your kids do something wrong or you're in a bad mood, they get to see it. Does anyone get to see, do you have anyone in your life when they come over, you invite them into the parts that you don't show other people, do you see? Why do you need to invite them in? Why do you have to do this? Because you will never have deep community if you never open up. You'll never have this because you will always have really great community between all these people and the you that you present to them. You know they love the you that you show. You know they love the you that you've spun together and put together. Oh, but you'll never know if they love the real you, the one that's messy underneath. You'll never really feel like, yeah, they have my back, because they don't know you. You didn't invite them in, you see. If all they see is a shined up version of who you really are, you'll never experience this kind of community. You'll never experience this kind of generosity, because they'll never be generous with you, only with the you present. So you got to be intentional, and you have to be generous, and you have to be inviting. You have to invite people in. And do you know why they could do this? We talked about it a bit already, but you know why they could do this? Look at the passage. They have this new engine powering their life. It says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the breaking of bread. Now, later on, it talks about breaking bread in their homes. Here, it talks about the breaking of bread, and a lot of commentators think that what breaking bread in their homes is meals. That's how you talked about eating. But the breaking of bread is the Lord's Supper. It's the table. It says they devoted themselves to the table. They devoted themselves to the teaching. In other words, they're constantly reacquainting themselves together with the gospel, with the new foundation, with the new cornerstone, with their new center. In other words, do you want to be intentional? He says, come to the table. Come to the table and see the bread and the wine, see the broken body and the shed blood. See how intentional he was with you. Do you want to be generous? Come to the table. See the broken body. See the blood shed. Do you see how generous he was with you? Do you want to be inviting? Come to the table. Come to the broken body. Come to the shed blood. Do you see how he invites? Do you see how he wants to be known? Do you see the lengths he would go to be known? Because knowing God is eternal life, he says. Come to the table. Devote yourself to the teaching. Devote yourself to the breaking of the bread. If you aren't building your life on this here, then community will always be peripheral for you. And your generosity will always have lines, and your invitation will always have lines, and your intentionality will always have lines, and you'll create space, but only so much. Until you come to the table, until you devote yourself to the apostles' teaching. He dies for us. He dies to make us a part of this. How much did he rearrange his life for us? How much of his lifestyle in heaven was upset so we could become a part of his family, so we could become a part of his community, so we could be friends? I have not called you servants, I've called you friends, he says. How can we not have our hearts melted, by this? How can we not rearrange our lives for one another when we come to the table? And so we turn to that now. We come to the table together, and we come to partake together. In 1 Corinthians, when it talks about the Lord's table, it talks about it, eating things in an unworthy manner. And a lot of people look at that and they say, I want to make sure that sort of my heart's right before God. And that's fair. But the unworthy manner that he's speaking of specifically there is a lack of real community, a lack of real generosity, a lack of togetherness that was manifested in the way that they were eating. They were sort of all eating, and the rich people were eating first, and other people were showing up late because they had to work, and they didn't get any food. And there's all this division. He says, no, you want to eat this in a worthy manner, you eat it together. You eat it as a family. You eat it as disciples walking together. And that's where we turn to now. And so I have the ushers come forward and pass the plates. And while they do that, I'll explain a bit of what's going on. Communion, the Lord's table, this thing that we take of, that I alluded to earlier, is a giant symbol. It's a symbol of the broken body of Jesus and the bread that's broken and the shed blood. in the juice that was spilled, you see? And so you pour the cup, you break the bread, and you take it into yourselves. And as you take it in, essentially what it's saying is you need to digest the gospel. You need him to be that focus of your life. Now, if you're not a Christian, this is one of the few times we'll ask you to not participate with us, not join us in this. Not because we don't want you here, not because we want you to feel excluded. It's because it's such a sacred symbol for us. This is something that is meant to demonstrate what we have believed, which is that this is where we find our life. This is the teaching we're devoted to. This is the generosity that makes us generous. This is the invitation that makes us invite. This is the intentionality that makes us intentional. This is the place we build our life, find forgiveness for our sins. We've turned our back on any other way of life and been drawn here. And being drawn here is what unites us together. And so as they pass the plate, as you take, we'll hold it together, or hold it so that we can take it together as a family, as a community, who's dedicated to him and therefore to one another. So I'll have some music as it's passed. You can meditate on what this symbolizes, and we'll come back together when everyone has the elements.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.